She was the woman the whole town laughed at, the laundress, the poor one, the one nobody wanted. When the mayor staged a public bride selection and she stepped onto that platform, the crowd didn't go quiet. They laughed louder. No man stepped forward, not one. She stood there for 5 full minutes while 200 people made sure she understood exactly what they thought she was worth. But she didn't run. Instead, she walked across that silent square, stopped in front of the most feared man in the territory, looked him straight in the eye and asked, "Will you marry me?" And what happened next changed everything, for her, for him, and for every powerful man who had spent years believing she could be ignored forever. If this story moves you, hit that like button, drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this has traveled. And don't go anywhere, because this is only the beginning. The morning of the selection event arrived with the kind of sky that made people feel like something important was about to happen. Wide and pale blue, the sun not quite warm enough yet to cut through the early chill that settled over Harlan Creek each autumn. By 8 o'clock, wagons were already lined up along the main road. People came in from their farms and homesteads, from the outlying cattle spreads, and the smaller towns that sat in Harlan Creek's shadow. They came because Mayor Aldous Crane had promised them a spectacle, and Aldous Crane rarely disappointed when it came to spectacle. Clara Whitmore watched them arrive from the side window of the laundry where she worked, her hands still damp from the morning's first load, her knuckles red and cracked the way they always were. She was 26 years old, though she looked older in certain lights, not from vanity or vanity's opposite, but from plain hard work that had settled into the lines around her eyes and the set of her jaw. She wasn't small, wasn't large, was not the kind of woman men noticed when she walked into a room. She had good, steady brown eyes and dark hair she wore pulled back tight because loose hair caught in the mangle press. Her clothes were clean. They were always clean. That, at least, she could control. "You aren't going to that circus, are you?" Mabel Pruitt called from the back room, her voice carrying the particular tone of someone who already knew the answer and disapproved of it. Clara didn't answer right away. She watched a family she recognized, the Hendersons from out near Copper Flat, climb down from their wagon, the mother already craning her neck toward the town square. "I'm thinking about it," she finally said. Mabel appeared in this doorway, drying her own hands on her apron. She was 60, broad-shouldered, and had the permanently suspicious expression of a woman who had seen too many bad ideas presented as good ones. For what purpose? To watch them parade those girls around like prize horses while Crane pats himself on the back? Maybe. "Clara, I'll be back before noon." Mabel made a sound that was not quite a word, and Clara set down her cloth, untied her work apron, and went out through the back. The selection event had been Mayor Crane's idea, which meant it had been designed to benefit Mayor Crane in some way that wasn't immediately obvious. The stated purpose was civic, a gathering of eligible young women from the territory, a chance for the prosperous ranchers and businessmen of the region to meet potential wives in a respectable public setting. Crane had arranged it with the same theatrical instinct he applied to everything, setting up a low wooden platform in the center of the square where the women would stand while the men of means circulated and made their choices. It was not as crude as an auction. It was careful to not be quite that. But it was close enough that most women with any options at all had declined to participate. The ones who had agreed were young, nervous, dressed in their best, and standing in a cluster near the platform when Clara arrived. She counted 7 of them. They ranged in age from perhaps 17 to what she guessed was 23, and every one of them was watching the assembled crowd with the careful, calculating attention of people who understood that today mattered. Clara found a spot near the hardware store, slightly to the side of the main crowd, and watched. Mayor Aldous Crane was already on the platform. He was a man of 52 with the kind of looks that had once been handsome and had since become something harder to define. Still commanding, but with an oiliness around the edges that showed up in the way he smiled. He wore his best suit, dark blue wool, and his hat was tilted at the angle he always used when he wanted to project authority without arrogance. Clara had known him, or known of him, her entire life. Her father had warned her about him once, years ago, in the distracted way that fathers sometimes say important things without realizing they're saying them. She hadn't understood it then. "Ladies and gentlemen of Harlan Creek," Crane began, his voice trained to carry, "what finer thing can a man do with a fine autumn morning than see to the future prosperity of our community?" Clara stopped listening. She watched instead, She watched the ranchers and businessmen gathered on the right side of the square, maybe 20 of them. Some she recognized, some she didn't. Most were middle-aged. Several were wealthy by local measure, which meant they owned land and cattle and had hired hands who did the dangerous work. And then, at the far edge of the crowd, standing alone and apart with the particular isolation of someone who had chosen it deliberately, she saw Gideon Ashcroft. She had seen him before. Everyone in Harlan Creek had seen Gideon Ashcroft at one point or another, though most people preferred not to. He was tall, not extraordinary tall, but the kind of tall that came with a particular quality of stillness that made him seem larger than he was. Somewhere in his late 30s, perhaps 40, with a beard that was dark at the jaw and going gray at the edges, and a face that carried no expression she could read at this distance. He wore a long coat, trail-worn and dark, and his hat was pulled low. He had not, as far as she could tell, spoken to anyone since arriving. People gave him a careful berth, the way they did with things that might bite. The stories about Gideon Ashcroft varied depending on who was telling them. He had shot 3 men in one night in a dispute over water rights. He had run off a cattle syndicate's hired gunmen with nothing but a rifle and a particular willingness to use it. He lived alone on a mountain ranch that nobody visited, and that he defended with a severity that had become something close to legend in the territory. Whether any specific story was true was impossible to verify, but the composite effect was real. People were afraid of him, and he did not seem to mind. What Clara noticed, watching him from across the square, was that he looked bored. Well, the selection proceeded. Crane called the young women up one by one, said flattering things about each of them, and the assembled men nodded or spoke quietly among themselves. 2 quick agreements were reached in the first hour. A rancher named Faulkner and a girl named Elsa Booth. Another between a merchant and a young woman whose name Clara didn't catch. The crowd was pleased. This was the kind of thing they had come for. Then one of the older women in the crowd, Harriet Dobbs, who ran the dry goods store and had a mouth like a rusty gate hinge, looked across the square and saw Clara standing at the edge. "Lord's sake," Harriet said, not quietly, "is that Clara Whitmore?" The woman next to her looked. Then the woman next to her. The ripple effect was immediate and ugly. Clara had been noticed before in this way. She recognized the sensation. The particular quality of attention that wasn't admiration and wasn't curiosity, but something meaner and more comfortable to its subjects. She kept her face still. "What's she doing here?" someone said, not quite quietly enough. "Oh, surely she isn't. She can't think she—" Crane, from the platform, noticed the disturbance and looked over. Something shifted in his expression when he saw Clara, something quick and careful that she couldn't quite name, and then he smiled his civic smile and said, loudly enough to be generous about it, "We welcome all women of the community to participate, of course." It was the kind of thing that sounds inclusive and is actually the opposite. The laughter started quietly, then spread. Clara felt it the way you feel weather, in the chest first, then everywhere. She was used to being poor. She was used to being plain. She had made a kind of accommodation with both of those facts years ago, a practical negotiation between what she wanted and what she was likely to get. But there was something about being laughed at in a crowd that still had the power to reach her in ways she didn't like admitting, even to herself. She could leave. That was the obvious choice. Walk back to the laundry, pick up her apron, put her hands back in the soapy water, and let this particular morning pass the way every other morning had passed. That was the sensible thing. She didn't do the sensible thing. She couldn't have explained afterward exactly why she walked toward the platform. She didn't know herself, not precisely. Something in her had simply moved past a threshold she hadn't known was there. Some cumulative weight of too many mornings, too many sideways glances, too many careful exclusions from the ordinary arrangements of life that other people seemed to move through without thinking. She wasn't angry, or not only angry. It was something quieter and more decided than anger. She walked to the platform. The laughter got louder as she approached. She heard specific words. Not all of them, but enough. She kept walking. Crane watched her come with an expression she recognized now as controlled alarm beneath the civic pleasantness. "Miss Whitmore," he said when she reached the base of the platform steps. "I want to participate," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she'd expected, which was something. The laughter crested. Someone made a comment she chose not to hear. Crane looked at her with the particular practiced sympathy of a man who was about to be publicly kind in a way that was actually cruel. Well, now, I don't think you said all women of the community were welcome. She held his gaze. Was that true or wasn't it? A beat. The crowd quieted slightly, not out of respect, but out of the anticipatory attention of people who sensed something was about to get worse. Of course, Crane said. Of course. Come up then. She went up. Standing on the platform was different from standing in the crowd. She was visible in a way she usually wasn't. She stood at one end of the platform, apart from the other women who had shifted slightly away from her, and she looked out at the assembled crowd of Harlan Creek. The faces she saw were amused, embarrassed for her, uncomfortable, or simply delighted in the way that people are sometimes delighted by other people's misfortune. No one stepped forward, not in the first minute, not in the second. The silence developed a texture. Not empty, but full of things that were being communicated without words. The ranchers and businessmen who had circulated and spoken and nodded throughout the morning found other places to look. Crane cleared his throat once. Then again. The laughter wasn't loud now. It was the quieter kind, shared between people through glances and small smiles, which was in some ways worse. Clara stood on that platform for 5 minutes. It felt longer. She counted her own heartbeats for a while, then stopped, because that wasn't helping. She was going to have to step down. She knew it. The alternative was standing here until Crane found a diplomatic way to remove her, which would be worse. She was going to step down, and then she was going to walk back through that crowd. And then this morning was going to become one of the stories that got told about Clara Whitmore at dinner tables and over back fences for years. She was already stepping back from the edge of the platform when she saw Gideon Ashcroft move. He hadn't moved the entire morning, had stood at the edge of the crowd with that particular stillness of his, watching everything with what she had taken for boredom. Now he shifted, turned his head, and his eyes found her on the platform. They stayed there. She didn't know what she saw in his face. From this distance it was impossible to read, but she saw him look at her in a way that was different from how everyone else had looked at her this morning. Without the amusement, without the embarrassment, without the careful neutrality of people trying not to notice. He looked at her the way you look at something you're actually seeing. Clara Whitmore had not planned what she did next. She would think about this later, many times, and she was never entirely able to account for it. Not the logic of it, not the calculation, because there wasn't any calculation. There was just the decision, sudden and clear, like stepping off a ledge you've been standing at the edge of for a long time. She stepped down from the platform. She walked across the square. The crowd parted for her in a surprised way, people stepping back not to make room, but because they weren't sure what she was doing. The laughter had died entirely. She heard the silence the way you hear silence after a loud noise, as an absence that has its own quality. She stopped in front of Gideon Ashcroft. Up close, he was more worn than he appeared from a distance. There were lines around his eyes that went deep. His coat had seen hard weather and hadn't entirely recovered. His hands, she noticed, were large and scarred at the knuckles in specific ways that suggested they had done physical work most of his life. He was looking at her with an expression that wasn't surprise exactly. It was more like a man who has been watching something approach for a long time and has decided to wait and see what it does when it arrives. "Mr. Ashcroft," she said. Her voice was steady again. She was glad of it. "I'm Clara Whitmore." "I know who you are," he said. His voice was lower than she'd expected, quieter. He didn't seem like a man who raised his voice often. She took a breath. "Will you marry me?" The silence in the square had the quality of held breath. She was aware of 200 people watching. She was aware of Crane on the platform behind her, and of the clustered women, and of every face that had been laughing at her 20 minutes ago now turned toward this moment, with something that had curdled past amusement into something it couldn't quite name. Gideon Ashcroft looked at her for a long moment. His expression didn't change, didn't shift into any of the things she was braced for. Not the laughter, not the gentle refusal, not the public humiliation that would have been worse than anything Crane had managed. He just looked at her steadily, as if he was reading something. Then slowly he reached up and removed his hat. It was a small gesture. It was also, in its way, enormous. Taking your hat off for someone meant something in this territory, in this time. It was an acknowledgement. It was a form of respect that nobody in this square had thought to show Clara Whitmore in longer than she could remember. "Yes," he said. The bureaucratic business of it took less than an hour. Harlan Creek had a circuit judge who happened to be in town that week, a narrow man named Breckett who seemed deeply confused about what was happening but was technically capable of performing the necessary ceremony. Crane attempted twice to intervene, both times with the air of a man who can't quite find the legal objection he's looking for. Gideon Ashcroft, it turned out, was not a man who could be easily intervened with when he had made up his mind, and he had, apparently, made up his mind. They stood in the courthouse, Clara and Gideon and Judge Breckett and two witnesses who had been pulled in off the street with the baffled expressions of people who were going to have a story to tell for the rest of their lives. Breckett read the words he was required to read. Clara said what she was required to say. Gideon said the same. It was not a romantic ceremony. There were no flowers. There was nobody there who wished them well with sincerity. Clara's hands were still rough and reddened from the morning's laundry work, and she hadn't had time to fix her hair, and she was wearing her second-best dress, which was not much of a distinction. When it was done and Breckett said it was done, Clara Whitmore, who was now, apparently, Clara Ashcroft, which she was going to need some time to absorb, looked at the man standing beside her and realized she had no idea who he was. She had just married a stranger about whom the primary information available was that he frightened people. This realization sat in her chest with a weight she hadn't anticipated. Gideon must have seen something in her face because he said quietly, "My wagon's out back. We've got a long ride if we want to make the mountain before dark." "All right," she said. "You can bring what you need. We'll send for the rest." She thought of Mabel Pruitt and the laundry, and her small room above the cooperage where she had lived for 4 years. She thought of her mother's old sewing box, which was the only thing from her family that she still had, and which she had been keeping at the laundry because her room had a leak that she'd never gotten around to fixing. She thought of the look on Crane's face when Gideon had said yes, not the expression of a man who has witnessed an amusing surprise, but the expression of a man who has witnessed something that has disrupted a calculation he was running. "I'll need an hour," she said. "Take it." Mabel Pruitt did not react the way Clara had expected. She didn't say "I told you so," which Clara had anticipated. She didn't lecture about rashness or consequences. She stood in the middle of the laundry for a moment after Clara told her, looking at the floor, and then she looked up and said, "Gideon Ashcroft." "Yes." Mabel was quiet for another moment. "Your father knew that man." Clara went still. "What?" "Years back before—" Mabel stopped, seemed to reconsider something. "I don't know the whole of it. I know they were friends. Your father spoke of him once or twice." She pressed her mouth together. "Be careful, Clara." "Of him?" "Of everything." Mabel went to the back room and came back with the sewing box, her mother's, cedar and brass-hinged, worn smooth at the corners from years of handling. She held it out. "Take this. I've been keeping it safe for you." Clara took it. It was heavier than she remembered, which was strange, and she almost said so. But Mabel's expression had the quality of someone who had said as much as she was going to say, and the hour was running down, and there were decisions behind Clara now that couldn't be unmade. She put the sewing box under her arm, said goodbye to Mabel Pruitt, and walked out to where Gideon Ashcroft was waiting with his wagon. The road into the mountains began at the north edge of town and climbed steadily for the first 3 miles before the terrain got serious. Clara sat on the wagon bench beside Gideon with the sewing box on her lap and watched Harlan Creek fall behind them and tried to take inventory of her situation in a practical way. She was married. She was married to a man she had spoken 40 words to. She was riding into the mountains with him and didn't know when or whether she would come back down. Gideon drove the way he did most things, without wasted motion, without apparent need to fill the silence. The horses were good animals, she noticed, well-kept, well-fed, responsive to his hands on the reins. That told her something, though she wasn't sure yet what. After perhaps 2 miles, she said, "Why did you say yes?" He didn't answer immediately. The wagon climbed a long grade and he worked the reins around a soft spot in the road before he spoke. "Because you asked," he said. "That's not a reason." "It's the reason I've got." She looked at him. His profile was turned toward the road. "You didn't say yes because you felt sorry for me." "No. You didn't say yes because you wanted to make a point in front of those people." A pause. "No." "Then I don't understand." He glanced at her briefly. Just a moment, then back to the road. You stood up on that platform knowing what was going to happen. You stood there for 5 minutes while they made it happen, and then instead of running off, you walked across the square and asked for what you wanted. He was quiet for a moment. I haven't seen that kind of steadiness in a long time. Clara sat with that for a while. The trees were thickening around them as the road climbed. The air was cooler up here, carrying the smell of pine and something mineral underneath it, rock and cold water somewhere nearby. You should know, she said, that I don't have anything. No money, no land, nothing to bring to this that's worth anything. I have land, he said. I have money enough. I'm not looking for those things. What are you looking for? He didn't answer that one. The wagon rolled on. A hawk crossed the sky above the tree line and dropped away behind the ridge. What was your father's name? Gideon said after a while. Something shifted in Clara's chest. Samuel Whitmore. She heard the breath he took. It was a small thing, controlled, deliberate, but she heard it. I knew him, Gideon said. She already knew, somehow. She had known since Mabel said it, had been turning it over in the back of her mind during the whole ride. But hearing him say it out loud was different. He talked about you, she said. Once or twice when I was young. I didn't know who you were then. He was a good man, Gideon said. The words came out without ornamentation, without the softened quality people usually put on statements about the dead. Just a plain fact delivered plainly. He died when I was 14, Clara said. They said it was an accident, that his horse threw him and he hit his head on the creek bed. The wagon hit a rough patch and she braced against the benchboard. Gideon steadied the horses with an automatic adjustment. What do you think? She said. He didn't answer for a long time, long enough that she thought he wasn't going to. I think, he said finally, that a man who has ridden mountain trails his whole life doesn't get thrown by a horse on a flat creek road in good weather. The cold that went through Clara then wasn't from the mountain air. She looked down at the sewing box on her lap. Her mother's box, cedar and brass, heavier than it should have been. Mabel had kept it safe for her, she had said. Be careful, Clara. She pressed her hand flat against the lid. There's something you're not telling me yet, she said. He glanced at her again. This time the look was longer. Yes, he said. Will you tell me when we get there? Yes, he said again. Clara turned back to the road ahead. The mountains closed around them, tall and dark and indifferent, and the sky above was beginning to shade toward the deep blue of afternoon. She didn't know what she was riding into. She didn't know this man beside her, didn't know the truth about her father, didn't know what was in the sewing box that made it heavier than it should have been. She had left behind everything she owned with an hour's notice and married a stranger in front of a confused judge, and 2 people pulled off the street. The sensible thing would have been to feel afraid. What she actually felt, sitting on that wagon bench with the mountains around her and the road climbing ahead, was something she hadn't felt in a very long time, like something was finally, after years of waiting, about to start. The ranch came into view just before the light gave out. Clara had been watching the trail for the last hour, tracking the way the mountain changed around them as they climbed. The trees growing older and more spaced out, the undergrowth thinning, the rock breaking through the soil in long gray shelves that the wagon wheels had to navigate carefully. Gideon knew the road without thinking about it, adjusting his hands on the reins before the rough patches appeared, taking the switchbacks at an angle that kept the load balanced. He had driven this route hundreds of times, maybe thousands. That kind of knowing lived in the body, not the mind. Then the trees broke open and she saw it. It wasn't what she'd expected, though she hadn't known what she was expecting. Something harsher, maybe. Something that matched the stories. What she saw instead was a low, solid house built from mountain stone and heavy timber, set back against a ridge that protected it from the north wind. A barn to one side, larger than the house and in better repair, which told her something about his priorities. A well with a good rope and pulley. A kitchen garden gone mostly to seed for the season, though she could see the organized rows where things had grown. A woodpile stacked with the kind of methodical precision that was either compulsive or simply the habit of a man who had spent years alone and had learned that disorder cost you in winter. A dog appeared from behind the barn. Some mixed breed, mostly shepherd by the look of it, gray-muzzled and moving with the careful dignity of an old animal. It came to Gideon's side of the wagon and stood there. "That's Holt," Gideon said, climbing down. Does he bite? Not anymore. He used to. She climbed down herself before he could come around to help, or not help. The dog, Holt, came to her immediately and put his nose against her hand with the focused attention of an animal conducting a serious assessment. Clara let him smell her and waited. He stepped back and sat down. Apparently she had passed. He likes you, Gideon said, with what might have been mild surprise. Animals usually do, she said. People less so. He looked at her for a moment, then turned toward the house. Come inside. I'll get the stove going. The inside of the house was clean in the way that a place is clean when one person has been maintaining it alone for a long time. No clutter, nothing out of place, but with a quality of emptiness that went beyond tidiness. There were 2 rooms and a loft. The main room held the stove, a table with 2 chairs, a shelf of books she noticed immediately, and a gun rack on the wall with 3 rifles that were all, she could tell even from across the room, kept in working order. A door led to what she assumed was a bedroom. The loft was accessed by a steep, ladder-like stair. Gideon got the stove going without ceremony. He moved around his own kitchen with the efficiency of a man who had done everything alone for so long that the presence of another person in the space was a variable he hadn't entirely accounted for yet. Clara set the sewing box on the table and sat down. The loft, he said without turning from the stove. It's yours. I put a mattress up there 2 years ago for when I had a hand who slept there one winter. The bed's good. She noticed the pause, the something he'd started to say and then redirected. She filed it away. Thank you, she said. He put a pot of water on the stove and found bread and some cold meat in the larder and set them on the table without asking if she was hungry. She was hungry. She hadn't eaten since early morning, before the selection event, before the platform and the walk across the square and the confused judge and the wagon and all the hours of mountain road. She ate without making ceremony of it, and he sat down across from her and ate too. And for a while, the only sounds were the stove ticking as it heated and the wind outside, and Holt settling against the door. Tell me about my father, she said. He didn't hesitate the way she expected. He set down his bread and looked at the table for a moment and then looked at her. How much do you know about what he owned before he died? Not much. I was young. After he was gone, my mother sold what she could, and we moved into town. We lost the house. Then she got sick, and we lost most of what was left. By the time she died, I was 17 and working. She paused. I always knew there should have been more. The land, at least. He talked about the land. The Whitmore Ranch, Gideon said. 420 acres south of the Cowboy River. Good grass, good water, a timber stand in the northeast corner worth more than most people realized at the time. Your father built it from a land grant, worked it for 12 years. Clara watched his face. It didn't just disappear when he died. No, Gideon said. It didn't. He was quiet for a moment, getting the order of things right in his mind, she thought, deciding where to start. She waited. Your father and I met in the fall of 1871, he said. I was 22, he was maybe 28, 29. I had just come into this territory and didn't know many people, and Samuel was the kind of man who talked to strangers when most people didn't bother. We ended up helping each other through a rough winter, and after that we stayed close. He picked up his cup and set it down again without drinking. He was one of the few people I've trusted completely in my life. That's not a common thing for me. And then he died, Clara said. And then he died. 6 months after you and your mother moved into town, Aldous Crane filed a claim on the Whitmore land, citing unpaid debts owed to a land company that nobody had ever heard of before that filing. The probate judge, a man named Ord, who has since moved on to other employment, ruled in the company's favor inside of 3 weeks. His voice was level, carrying the specific flatness of old anger that has been lived with long enough to become something more like fact. The company turned out to be a shell. The debts were fabricated. I dug into it as far as I could at the time and hit walls everywhere. The paperwork was real enough to hold up in any court Crane had access to, which was every court in this territory. Clara's hands had gone still on the table. He had my father killed for his land. I believe so. I can't prove it, not with what I have, which is why it has stayed the way it has stayed for 12 years. He looked at her directly. Until today. What changed today? You married me. She looked at him. I don't understand what that changes. Gideon leaned back slightly. Crane has had 12 years to feel safe about what he did. The Whitmore name is gone from the land records. Your mother is dead. You're a laundress with no resources and no standing, and the one person who knew the truth and was in a position to cause trouble, me, has been isolated up here on a mountain that's easier to avoid than to deal with. Something in his expression shifted. Not quite a hardness, because it was already hard, but a different quality of it. Today you walked across that square and stood in front of me in front of 200 witnesses and asked for my help. Whatever Crane saw in that moment, what he understood is that the situation has changed. The last Whitmore just allied herself with the one man he was afraid to come after directly. Clara was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the wind had picked up, moving around the eaves with a low sound. The stove had gotten the room warm enough that the chill in her hands was starting to ease. He'll come after us, she said. Yes. Soon? Sooner than he would have otherwise. He met her eyes. I need you to understand what you've stepped into. I've been waiting for a way to move on this for years, and I'm not going to pretend I didn't see today as an opportunity, because it was. But I didn't take that opportunity without knowing it has costs. She appreciated that he said it plainly. She would have noticed if he hadn't. Why didn't you ever just go to a federal authority, a marshal, someone outside Crane's reach? I tried, he said, and there was something in those two words that was heavier than anything else he'd said. 4 years ago, I put together what I had, circumstantial, mostly, but enough to raise questions, and I contacted a federal marshal's office out of the territory capital. The man who came to meet me turned out to be someone Crane had gotten to first. Nothing happened. The inquiry was closed, and 6 months after that, someone shot at me from the tree line on the South Trail. Clara looked at him. Someone tried to kill you. Someone tried, he agreed. They weren't good enough. And you just stayed here and waited. You build the case, or you don't build it at all, he said. Going off half-prepared just means you get buried faster. She stood up and went to the window. Outside, the dark had come fully now, and the only thing she could see was her own reflection in the glass. A woman she almost didn't recognize, standing in a stranger's house in a mountain she'd never been on, wearing a ring that hadn't existed this morning. The sewing box, she said. What? She turned around. Mabel Pruitt, the woman I worked for. When I went to say goodbye, she gave me my mother's sewing box. She said she'd been keeping it safe. She paused. She said, be careful, not be happy, not good luck, not anything you'd say to someone getting married. She said, be careful. Gideon was looking at the box on the table with an expression she couldn't read. Did you ever know Mabel? She asked. No, but I knew your mother slightly toward the end, before she died. He got up and went to the window too. Not to look out, but to be closer to thinking, she felt. Samuel talked about a box. He said, if anything ever happened to him, there was a place his wife knew about, something he'd kept back in case it was ever needed. The air in the room changed quality. Clara looked at the box. She had carried it on her lap for 4 hours without thinking about it as anything other than what it had always been. Her mother's sewing things, needles and thread and a thimble, and the small objects that accumulate in a woman's life without particular meaning. She went to the table and lifted the lid. The top tray held what she expected, thread in several colors, 2 needles in a cloth sleeve, a pair of small scissors, a thimble that she remembered her mother wearing. She lifted the tray out. Beneath it was a flat panel of cedar, the bottom of the box she had always assumed. She pressed her finger against it and felt it shift, just slightly. Not the bottom, a false bottom. She looked up at Gideon. He was watching her with the kind of stillness that meant he was working to keep his expression under control. She found the edge of the panel. It was fitted tight, but there was a seam, almost invisible, and worked her fingernail into it and lifted. The space beneath was perhaps 1.5 inches deep. Inside it, folded and refolded into a tight rectangle, was a set of papers. Clara unfolded them with hands that were not quite steady. Gideon came to the table and stood beside her, close enough to read over her shoulder, and she was aware of his presence but didn't look at him because she couldn't take her eyes off what she was holding. Land deeds. Original land deeds, handwritten and officially stamped, for 420 acres along the Callaway River. Samuel Whitmore, registered holder. The filing date was 1868. She knew enough about land documents to recognize that these were primary records, not copies, not filings, but originals. They would carry different weight than anything derived from them. And underneath the deeds, something else. Letters. Several of them, written in a hand she didn't know, addressed to someone referred to only as the councilman. She read the first one, then the second. Her chest got tight in a way that had nothing to do with the elevation. They were instructions. Financial instructions. Specifically instructions for the transfer of funds between two accounts, one of which had a name she recognized. The land company that Crane had used for the fraudulent claim. The letters were not signed, but the handwriting matched a third document, a deed of sale, clearly fraudulent, that had been used in the original probate proceeding, which someone, her father, she understood now, had managed to obtain and preserve. Same hand, same ink pattern. It was not a smoking gun in a court of law, but it was something. It was more than something. He knew, she said, not loudly. He knew what they were planning, and he put all of this away where he thought it would be safe. Gideon picked up one of the letters and read it. His jaw had set. He must have gotten access to these documents shortly before. He was building a case. And then he died before he could use it. Yes. She set the papers down on the table carefully, the way you set down something breakable. Her mother had known about this, had kept it for 12 years in the bottom of a cedar sewing box, had trusted Mabel Pruitt with the keeping of it, and had never, never known what to do with it? Never had anyone to give it to who could use it, or had been afraid. That was also possible. Her mother had been a quiet woman, gentle in the way of people who have been worn down by things, and she had spent the last years of her life simply trying to survive and raise a daughter. Fear was not cowardice. It was sometimes just the most rational response available. Clara thought about her mother's hands on this box, lifting the false bottom, making sure the papers were there, still safe, putting the bottom back and setting the sewing things back in and closing the lid. She protected it her whole life, Clara said. Gideon didn't say anything. She was glad he didn't say anything. Some things don't need a response. Maud. She slept badly that first night. The loft mattress was adequate and the blankets were warm enough, but her mind wouldn't settle. It kept moving through the day in fragments, the platform, the walk across the square, Gideon's face when he'd taken off his hat, the road into the mountains, the papers on the table. Somewhere around 2 a.m, she gave up and lay on her back, staring at the sloped ceiling, and let her mind do what it was going to do. She was thinking about Crane's face, the moment he'd registered that Gideon had said yes. She'd had her back to him by then, but she'd seen it as she turned. Just a flash, the careful civic pleasantness slipping for a second, something colder and more calculating showing underneath. He had recovered instantly. But she had seen it. He was going to move fast. Whatever Gideon thought about the timeline, Clara's instinct was that Crane was not a man who would sit with uncertainty for long. He was a man who controlled things. That was the engine that drove him. The idea that the last Whitmore had walked into the mountains with the one man he'd never been able to neutralize, that they were up here together, that there were things her father might have known. He would not be comfortable leaving that alone. She heard Gideon moving downstairs before first light, the sounds of the stove being opened, the careful arrangement of kindling. She lay still for a few minutes and then got up. He was standing at the stove when she came down, and the coffee was already on. He looked at her without visible surprise at her being awake, which she appreciated. "Sleep?" he said. "Some," she said, which wasn't entirely dishonest. He poured her coffee and set it on the table, and she sat down and wrapped both hands around the cup. "We need to talk about what to do with those documents," she said. "Yes. And we need to do it before Crane figures out what we have." Gideon sat down across from her. In the morning light, without the wagon and the road and the strangeness of the day behind them, she could look at him more clearly. He had the face of a man who had spent a great deal of time outdoors and not much time in comfortable places, weathered in a real way, not a picturesque one. The gray in his beard was more pronounced than she'd noticed the day before. He looked tired in the specific way of someone who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time. "There are 2 things those papers can do," he said. "One is serve as evidence in a legal proceeding. The other is serve as leverage." He looked at his cup. I've been thinking about which is safer, and I'm not sure it's the legal proceeding. Because Crane has the courts. He has the local courts, he has the county judge, the county sheriff, half the local land board. Federal is different. He paused. But getting those papers to a federal authority without them being intercepted is a problem I don't have a solution to yet. Who do you trust outside of this territory? He thought about it seriously, which she liked. He didn't give her a quick answer to seem capable. There's a man, Thomas Reed. He was a federal land agent until about 3 years ago. Now he's in private law. We worked together once, briefly, in a dispute that never went anywhere. He's clean, not because he's a good person exactly, but because he's ambitious in a particular direction that doesn't benefit from being bought. He looked at her. Getting a message to him without it going through Crane's people is the first problem. Is she's archimate all-choting. I can get a message through Mabel, Clara said. Gideon raised an eyebrow slightly. Mabel Pruitt has been keeping my family's secrets for 12 years, Clara said. She knows how to be careful, and nobody in Crane's network is paying attention to a 60-year-old laundress. He looked at her for a moment. That's good thinking. I have some. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but the territory adjacent to one. It was the first time she'd seen anything like it on his face, and it changed the landscape of it, briefly. The first week was the strangest of Clara's life, and it had competition. She was not a guest, and not quite a resident, and not what most people would have called a wife, and she and Gideon were both finding the edges of what the arrangement was supposed to mean in practice. He was not unkind. He was also not warm, particularly, though she suspected warmth was not something he had a lot of practice with after years of isolation. He gave her room. He didn't ask her to do things, or not do things, which left her to figure out for herself what her place in the daily work of the ranch was. She figured it out. The kitchen garden still had some late-season root vegetables that nobody had pulled yet. She pulled them. The kitchen had supplies organized in a way that made functional sense, but didn't make cooking sense. She reorganized them without comment. Holt had a thorn in his left rear paw that he'd been favoring, which she found and extracted, which elevated her significantly in Holt's estimation and somewhat in Gideon's. He watched her do these things with the quality of attention she was coming to recognize as his version of engagement, quiet, observant, without much comment. Sometimes he seemed almost surprised, as if he had expected something different and was recalibrating. She didn't ask what he'd expected. She wasn't sure she wanted to know yet. On the 4th day, she went with him to check the south fence line. It was a 3-hour ride into rough terrain, and he hadn't suggested she come. He'd been saddling his horse at dawn when she came out of the house and said, "I'm coming." And he had looked at her once and then gone and saddled a second horse without discussion. It was on that ride that she started to understand the land. The Ashcroft Mountain wasn't huge by some measures, but it was terrain that rewarded knowing. The way the ridgelines channeled wind, the places where the rock faces caught morning sun and melted ice early in the season, the hidden stream that ran parallel to the South Trail before cutting east, the narrow pass above the timberline that was the only practical way in or out of the ranch's upper range. Gideon showed her these things, not in a teaching way, but in the way you point out familiar things to someone who has come to share your space. She paid attention. She had always paid attention, even when there was nothing worth paying it to. "Who built the pass wall?" she asked, at one point looking at a low, dry stone construction along the eastern edge of the trail. "I did," he said, 3 years ago. "Why there?" He looked at it for a moment. "Because it's the only place on the whole south approach where someone coming up fast doesn't have sight lines on the trail ahead. They come around that corner and they're 15 feet from the wall before they see it." She understood then that the wall had not been built for livestock management. It was a tactical construction, designed to slow, disrupt, or halt an approach from below. He had been expecting trouble for a long time. He had been building for it. She thought about that on the ride back, and about what it meant to live in that kind of anticipation, to shape your home and your land around the expectation that one day something would come for you and you would need to be ready. It wasn't paranoia, she had decided by the time they reached the barn. It was just living with your eyes open in a particular kind of country. The message went to Mabel through a ranch hand named Dewey, who came down to town for supplies every 10 days, and who Gideon trusted, after some consideration, to carry it without asking questions. Mabel was to pass it to a specific address in the territory capital, a lawyer's office, without going through Harlan Creek's post office, which they both assumed Crane monitored in some fashion. Then they waited. It was during the waiting that things started to happen. On the 9th day after the message was sent, Dewey came back from his supply run with information that made Gideon's expression go careful in a way Clara hadn't seen before. 3 strangers had arrived in Harlan Creek the previous afternoon, rode in together, put their horses up at the livery, took rooms at the hotel. Nobody knew their names. They'd had a meeting with Crane at the town hall that same evening, which had gone on for 2 hours with the doors shut. This morning they'd bought ammunition at the general store, enough that the clerk had noted it. He didn't waste time, Clara said. No. Gideon was standing at the window. Holt was at his feet, alert in the particular way of a dog who has read the room and knows something is happening. How long before they come up? If they're scouts, they'll ride the perimeter first. That's 2-3 days. If Crane sends them straight up, he turned from the window. We need to move those papers. Where? He had thought about this, she could tell. There's a place on the North Ridge. I'll show you tomorrow. He paused. And I need you to know the ranch. Every trail, every approach, the way I know it. She looked at him. You're planning for the possibility that we get separated. I'm planning for every possibility, he said. That's one of them. She thought about her mother's sewing box, about the weight of a secret kept for 12 years, the cost of it, the patience it required, about her father, who had gathered his evidence and hidden it and then died before it could matter. She was not going to let it sit hidden for another 12 years. Teach me the North Ridge, she said. First light, he said. First light. Outside, the wind had come up again the way it did most evenings on the mountain, moving through the pines with a long, low sound that had taken her several nights to stop hearing as something else. She was getting used to it now. She was getting used to a lot of things. The way the light shifted on the rock faces in the afternoon, the weight of the elevation in her chest when she worked hard, the sound of Gideon in the kitchen before dawn, the particular rhythm of his movements in a space that was starting, slowly and without ceremony, to become a shared space rather than his space. She didn't know yet what they were to each other. She thought he didn't know either, and that they were both, in their separate ways, approaching that question with the care of people who had both been burned before and didn't want to be burned again in the same direction. But she knew what they were against. She knew who had killed her father. She had his evidence in her hands finally, 12 years later. And she had, for the first time in a long time, someone standing in the same direction she was standing. That wasn't nothing. Right now, that was enough to build on. She put more wood on the stove and went to the shelf and found one of the books. A surveying manual, well thumbed, with margin notes in Gideon's hand, and sat down to read about topography until her eyes gave out, because if she was going to learn this mountain, she might as well start tonight. The North Ridge took 3 days to learn properly. Gideon showed her the way he showed her everything, by moving through it without narration and letting her ask questions when she had them, which meant she had to pay close enough attention to know what to ask. The first morning, he took her up the primary trail, slow enough that she could mark the features, the place where the path narrowed between 2 granite faces, the overhang above the second switchback that would conceal a person lying flat, the loose shale field on the eastern slope that looked passable but would take a horse's leg if you weren't careful. She noticed that he moved through these places with a specific kind of awareness, not tension exactly, more like the low-level alertness of someone who had long ago decided that not paying attention was a luxury he couldn't afford. The second day she went up alone. She made mistakes, took a wrong fork above the timberline that cost her 40 minutes, misjudged the distance between 2 landmarks she'd been using to orient herself. She came back down at midday, found Gideon at the fence line, and told him where she'd gone wrong without dressing it up. He listened, corrected 2 assumptions she'd been making about the ridge's geometry, told her to go back up. She went back up. The third day she moved through the North Ridge without hesitation and came back down and said so, and he nodded once, which from him was the equivalent of a longer acknowledgement from most people. It was on the morning of the 12th day after the message had been sent south that Dewey came back from a supply run 2 days early, riding faster than was his habit, and Clara knew before he pulled up at the barn that something had changed. Sheriff Dole rode out to the Callaway crossing yesterday, Dewey said, still on his horse, talking to Gideon. Put up a notice on the post. Says there's a warrant for your arrest. Both of you. He looked at Clara with the apologetic expression of someone delivering news they'd rather not. Charges of claim jumping on the Whitmore parcel. Says you've been threatening landholders in the area. Gideon's face didn't move. Who swore the affidavit? Crane, far as I could tell, and 2 other names I didn't recognize. The 3 men from the hotel, Clara said. Gideon looked at her. She looked back at him. Have you heard anything from the Capitol? She asked Dewey. Anything at all? Nothing yet, ma'am. She turned and walked back to the house. Behind her, she heard Gideon tell Dewey to rest the horse and stay close to the ranch today, and then his footsteps following her in. She was already at the table when he came through the door, the surveying manual open in front of her, though she wasn't reading it. She was thinking. She had been thinking since the moment Dewey said the word warrant, running it through from multiple angles the way she'd learned to run problems through in the years when problems were the primary feature of her life. This is faster than I expected, she said. It is. He's not waiting to see what we do. He's trying to define the situation before we can. She looked up. If there's a warrant, anyone who helps us becomes an accessory to whatever he's claiming we did. That includes Mabel. That includes Dewey. That potentially includes Thomas Reed if the message ever reached him. Gideon sat down. Yes. So he's trying to cut us off. More than that, a warrant gives Dole legal cover to come up here with men. Not just the 3 from the hotel, the whole sheriff's office, however many hired guns Crane wants to attach to it. He was quiet for a moment. They'll come in force if they come. Clara closed the manual. When? Not today. Getting men organized takes time, even for Crane, and Dole is cautious. He won't want to come up a mountain trail without knowing what he's riding into. He looked at the window. 2 days, maybe 3. Then we have 2 days. To do what? She had been thinking about that since Dewey said the word warrant. She had been thinking about the papers, the deeds, the letters, the fraudulent deed of sale in the same handwriting as the letters, which were currently hidden in a sealed oilskin pouch tucked into a rock crevice 40 feet below the North Ridge's highest point. Safe from most things, but not from a coordinated search by men who had time and numbers and a legal warrant to be on the property. We can't wait for Reed to respond, she said. That window is closing. I know. And we can't fight off a sheriff's party legally. Even with the papers we don't have standing yet. We're the ones with warrants. I know that too. So we need someone outside Crane's reach to have those papers before the sheriff gets here. She pressed her fingers flat on the table. Is there anyone in this territory, not the county, not anyone Crane touches, who has both the authority to receive them and the willingness to act? Gideon was quiet for a long moment. There's a circuit magistrate, he said slowly. Harmon Freed. He operates out of the Northern District, which doesn't overlap with Crane's county jurisdiction. He's old and he's irritable, and he does not like Aldous Crane. That's not a secret. There was a land dispute 3 years ago between their respective jurisdictions that got ugly at the administrative level. Whether he'd act on what we give him is another question. Where's he based? Millhaven, 20 miles north by the main road, 12 by the high trail. Clara looked at him. Can we get someone there and back before the sheriff moves? Dewey can ride it, Gideon said. If he leaves at first light tomorrow, he could be in Millhaven by midday, getting Freed to act on a document he receives from a stranger with warrants on his head. I'll write a letter, Clara said. He'll have the original deeds, the original letters, the fraudulent document, and a full written account from me. I'll sign it. She paused. My father's name carries something, even after 12 years. People knew Samuel Whitmore as an honest man. I can use that. Gideon looked at her for a moment. You're putting yourself on paper, attached to those documents. If it goes wrong, it's already gone wrong, she said. I'm the one with a warrant on my head for property I don't even own yet. I'd rather be documented in fighting than careful and buried. He held her gaze, then he nodded once and got up to find paper. Check. She wrote for 3 hours that evening, long after Gideon had gone to bed. She wrote carefully. Not carefully in the sense of hedging, but carefully in the sense of precision. She laid out the timeline. Samuel Whitmore's land grant, the 12 years of operation, the death and its suspicious circumstances, the probate proceeding and its timeline that was too fast for honest process, the shell company, the letters and what they documented, She wrote about the handwriting match between the letters and the fraudulent deed. She wrote about Gideon's earlier attempt to reach federal authorities and what had happened. She wrote about the 3 men who had arrived in Harlan Creek the day after her marriage and bought ammunition and met with Crane behind closed doors. She wrote about the warrant that had appeared 9 days later. She wrote it like a person making a record, not like a person asking for help. There was a difference, and she thought it mattered. When she was done, she sealed the letter with the papers inside an oilskin packet identical to the one on the North Ridge. Gideon had 2, and addressed it to Magistrate Harmon Freed, Northern District, Millhaven, with her name and Gideon's signed across the seal. She didn't sleep much that night either. Dewey left before dawn with the packet in his saddlebag and instructions that were simple. Reach Freed, put the packet in his hands personally, wait for a written response, and ride back. Do not go through Harlan Creek in either direction. Do not stop anywhere long enough for anyone to get a good look at him. You think he'll do it? Gideon said, watching Dewey's horse disappear into the pre-dawn dark. I think he's a good man, Clara said. I think good men can be trusted to do what they say. Usually. Usually is enough right now. They went back inside. The day that followed was the kind of day that sits wrong. Too quiet, too ordinary, while underneath it something is moving that you can't see yet. Gideon checked the perimeter of the ranch property twice. Clara finished the last of the kitchen garden harvest and restacked the woodpile and did it all with one ear turned toward the south trail and her mind working through contingencies. In the afternoon, she went up to the North Ridge and moved the oilskin pouch that was still hidden there, moved it from the rock crevice to a new location she'd identified on the 3rd day, deeper under the overhang, in a place that would require someone who knew the ridge well to find. Then she climbed to the highest point of the ridge and looked south toward Harlan Creek, 12 miles away and out of sight below the tree line, and thought about Crane sitting in his office down there, making his calculations. He had 12 years of security behind him, 12 years of the thing being done and buried and settled. And now it was not settled, and he knew it wasn't settled, and the man he was afraid of was no longer alone on the mountain. She thought about how that must feel, the slow erosion of certainty that had been so long and solidly established. It would make him reckless, she thought. It would push him toward doing something that felt decisive even if it wasn't tactically sound. Men like Crane couldn't tolerate uncertainty for long. It went against the fundamental logic of how they operated. She came back down in the late afternoon and found Gideon at the barn, doing a thing she had noticed him doing before when he was thinking, cleaning a rifle he had already cleaned, the repetitive mechanical work of it freeing up the part of his mind that needed to move. "They'll come at night," she said, "or at first light." He looked up. "What makes you say that?" "Because Dole is cautious and Crane is impatient, and those 2 things together means they'll try for the approach that looks safest to Dole while feeling fastest to Crane. Night or first light, they can get up the south trail and be at the ranch before we have full visibility." She sat down on a hay bale. How many men could come up the south trail at once? 3 abreast in most places, single file through the narrow. And there's only one good approach to the south trail that doesn't involve either the loose shale or the long way around. The Callaway Fork, yes. So anyone coming up has to come through the Callaway Fork first, which is, she had the surveying manual's information in her head now, had spent 3 days building it there deliberately, which is below the switchback, which is below the second granite face, which is below the overhang. Gideon set down the rifle and looked at her. She could see him following her thinking. "The overhang," she said. "What's above it?" He was very still for a moment. "A fractured ledge. I've never tried to move it because the trail below is the only practical route to the upper range, and bringing it down would close the south approach entirely. Until we don't need the south approach anymore." Clara, "What's above the fractured ledge?" she said. "Rock and more rock, or is there anything loose?" He stood up, walked to the barn door and looked south, though there was nothing to see in that direction from here. She waited. "Above the ledge there's a secondary field," he said slowly. "Talus? Loose shale and glacial debris that's been sitting on a 12-degree slope for however long. I've looked at it before and thought it was an accident waiting for a reason." "How large?" "Large enough to close the south trail for a season if it came down. And if someone triggered it deliberately." "From above there are 2 anchor points," he said. 2 large formations that are holding the field in equilibrium. Remove those and the whole thing goes." She looked at him steadily. Can it be triggered without being directly in the path? From the east side of the overhang, there's a shelf. He stopped. It would be a near thing. How near? Near enough that I wouldn't send you up there. She stood up from the hay bale. You're not sending me anywhere. I'm asking whether it's physically possible to trigger the slide from a position that's survivable. He looked at her for a long moment. In the quiet of the barn, Holt shifted and resettled. One of the horses blew out a breath. Yes, Gideon said. If you knew exactly where to be and exactly when to move, then teach me exactly where to be, she said. But he taught her that evening, in the last hour of light, taking her up to the overhang and walking her through every foot of the terrain above it. The position of the two anchor formations, the way the talus field was weighted, the shelf on the east side of the overhang that would put a person out of the direct path of the slide. He showed her the specific angle from the shelf to the first anchor. He showed her how to move from that angle to the second position, and from the second position back to the east trail that ran above and parallel to the south approach. He was thorough. He was also, she could tell, deeply uncomfortable with what he was showing her, though he kept it out of his voice. On the way back down, she said, "You're worried I'll get it wrong." "I'm worried about a lot of things." "Name one." He was quiet until they reached the lower trail. "I'm worried," he said, "that I've gotten you into something I can't get you out of." She thought about that, about the specific quality of it, the weight he put on the word "I've." As if the morning of the selection event had been his doing, as if she had been a passive element in a sequence of events that he had set in motion. "Gideon," she said. He kept walking. "I walked across that square." "You didn't pull me across it. You didn't know what you were walking into." "No. But I knew I was walking into something." She paused. "I was tired of standing still." He didn't answer. They walked the rest of the way down in the dark that was settling fast through the trees, and she thought about her father, who had also known he was walking into something and had tried to be prepared and hadn't been prepared enough. She thought about the difference between her father's situation and hers. The difference was standing 6 feet ahead of her on the trail, knew this mountain the way he knew his own hands, and was, whatever else he was or wasn't, on her side. That was a difference that mattered. They came at first light on the second day. Dewey was still in Millhaven, or somewhere between Millhaven and home, and there had been no message from Thomas Reed in the capital, and the warrant was still hanging over both their names. And when Holt woke Clara with a low sound at 4:30 in the morning, she knew immediately what it meant because she had been half expecting it and sleeping accordingly. She was down from the loft and at Gideon's door before he opened it. He was already dressed. "South Trail," he said. "How many?" "Can't tell yet. Holt doesn't like the number." They moved without lights. Gideon took his rifle from the rack and checked it with the automatic precision of someone for whom checking a rifle is as natural as checking the weather. He handed her the smaller of the 2 revolvers he owned. He had shown her how to use it 3 days ago, a practical session without ceremony that she had taken seriously. The weight of it in her hand was still unfamiliar but not foreign. "If they come through the Callaway Fork, they'll be at the Narrow in 40 minutes, he said. "I'll take the position at the stone wall. Alone. From the wall I can hold the Narrow for a significant amount of time. The question is how many—" "Gideon," she stopped him. "If there are enough of them, holding the Narrow isn't a solution, it's a delay. You hold them at the Narrow and eventually they go around or they get through, and then you're below them and they're above you, and the numbers win." He knew this. She could see that he knew it. "The slide is the solution," she said. "You at the wall gives me time to get above the overhang. And if something goes wrong above the overhang, then we're in the same position we'd be in without the slide, just with me in a bad spot." She looked at him directly. "The slide gives us a chance we don't otherwise have. Without it, we're just 2 people with guns against however many Crane sent, and I don't think Crane sent 2. He was very still. Outside, the darkness was beginning to thin at its edges, that first gray suggestion of light that wasn't quite light yet. In less than an hour, it would be dawn. "The east shelf," he said finally. "The exact position I showed you. I know where it is. You move the moment the second anchor gives. Not before, not after. The moment it gives. I know. The east trail back is not a running trail. You walk it fast, you don't run it." "I know, Gideon." He looked at her for another moment. Then he said, "Go." she went. The South Trail in near darkness was a different thing from the South Trail in daylight. She had climbed it enough times now that her feet knew the general shape of it, but the specific features, the rocks that wanted to turn an ankle, the route that crossed the path at shin height just before the second fork, required more care than she had time to give them fully. She moved fast and careful, pushing the balance between them, and she made the base of the overhang in 30 minutes. She could hear them by then, not clearly. Sound in mountain terrain at night does strange things, bounces off surfaces it shouldn't, disappears in places it should carry. But she could hear the collective sound of multiple horses on a trail below, the clinking and shifting of men carrying equipment, the low exchange of voices. She counted the sounds as she climbed toward the overhang. More than 5. She thought 8, maybe 10, maybe more. The east shelf was where Gideon had shown her. She reached it and flattened herself against the rock face and looked down along the angle he had described. Below her, the talus field sat in the gray pre-dawn like something patient and enormous, a held breath of displaced geology. She could hear the horses getting closer. Below, distant but clear in the mountain quiet, she heard a sound that was unmistakably a rifle shot, then another. Gideon at the stone wall. The horses below the overhang stopped. She heard voices, urgent now, the sound of a group reconfiguring in response to unexpected resistance. They had expected to come up the trail and find 2 people asleep and unsuspecting. They had found something else. A voice, commanding, not young, said something she couldn't fully make out. The word around was in it. They were going to try to go around the narrow. She looked at the first anchor formation. It was a granite block, roughly the size of a wagon, sitting at the upper edge of the talus field with a calculated precariousness that only looked stable until you understood the weight distribution behind it. Gideon had showed her the wedge point, the specific spot where the force needed to be applied. He had showed her how to apply it. She worked the first anchor for 4 minutes that felt like an hour, using the iron bar Gideon had given her, a fence post driver, repurposed, heavy enough to do what needed doing. The block moved in increments, each one requiring more from her than the last. Her hands were shaking from the effort by the time she felt it begin to shift with its own weight. She moved to the second position. This one was smaller but more critical, the keystone of the whole field's equilibrium. Below her, she could hear men moving off the trail, voices, and one gunshot from lower on the slope that was clearly aimed at Gideon. She hit the second anchor twice, 3 times. On the 4th strike, she felt it go. Not all at once, but in a sequence, the way things fall when they fall truly, each piece taking the next with it. The first anchor was already moving. The talus field, which had been patient for years, ran out of patience. The sound was enormous. She didn't have another word for it. It was the sound of a hillside deciding to be somewhere else. A deep tearing roar that started above her and built as it went and swallowed the sounds of everything below it. She was already moving on the east trail, walking fast the way he'd told her, not running, each foot placed with the deliberate care of someone who knows that a sprained ankle up here is not a minor inconvenience. Behind her, the sound went on for what felt like a long time. Then it diminished, settled into a lower rumbling, then stopped. The east trail ran parallel to the south approach and above it. From certain points, she could see down through the trees to sections of the south trail. She looked when she had a clear angle. The south trail was gone. Not buried, exactly. More like the terrain had been rearranged, a new configuration of rock and debris that had converted a passable trail into something that would take days to clear with serious equipment. She could see 2 horses down there, riderless, moving nervously along the debris field's edge. She could not see any men from where she was. She didn't know yet whether that was good or bad. She reached the upper junction of the east trail and came down to the main path and moved toward the stone wall, and she was thinking about Gideon every step of the way, thinking about the shots she had heard, thinking about whether holding the narrow had cost him something she couldn't fix. He was at the wall when she came around the lower bend, standing, which she registered with a wave of something she didn't take time to name. He had a cut above his left eye that was bleeding freely down the side of his face in the specific way that head cuts do, and he was looking down the slope at the debris field with an expression she couldn't read. "Are you hurt?" she said. "A rock," he said, from the slide. "How bad?" "Not bad." He turned and looked at her. There was something in his face she hadn't seen before, Not exactly shock, but the close cousin of it, the look of a man who has had his understanding of something revised without warning. That was, "Did any of them make it through the narrow?" she said. He came back to himself. 2. They went back down when the slide started. He paused. The rest were between the narrow and the Callaway fork when it came down, below the slide zone. He looked at the debris field again. They're not dead, most of them, but they're not coming up today. Clara sat down on the ground at the base of the stone wall. Her legs had gone the way legs go when the emergency that was holding them together is resolved. She sat in the dirt with her back against the wall and her hands in her lap and just breathed for a moment. Gideon crouched in front of her. He had blood on his face and trail dust on his coat, and he looked at her with that expression still on him, the revised understanding one. "You all right?" he said. "Give me a minute," she said. He gave her a minute. "They'll go back to Crane," she said when the minute was over. "Tell him what happened. He'll try something else." "Yes." "He has to. He can't let this stand." She looked up at him. "He'll go legal. He's been using force because he thought it would be easier, but it hasn't been easier. He'll go back to the courts. And we still don't have confirmation from Reed or Freed." "No." She stood up, brushing dirt off her hands. "But we will." She said it not because she was certain, but because not saying it was not a useful option. "He'll go to the courts and we'll go to the courts, and we have what we have." Gideon was looking at her with that expression still on his face. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. But it wasn't nothing. She could see that it wasn't nothing. She let it go for now. They walked back to the ranch in the growing morning light, Holt appearing from somewhere and falling in at their heels. And the mountain was quiet around them in the specific way it goes quiet after something large has happened, as if it is listening to its own altered shape. The sewing box was still on the table where she'd left it the night before. The false bottom was closed. The original papers were in Dewey's saddlebag somewhere between here and Millhaven, and the situation they were in was worse by most measures than it had been 2 days ago, and better in one specific way. The men who had come up the mountain to bury the problem quietly had gone back down without what they'd come for. And the woman they'd come to remove from the equation was standing at the stove putting water on for coffee, her hands still shaking slightly from the iron barwork, her boots leaving mountain dirt on the floorboards, trying to figure out what came next. She didn't know what came next, but she was still here to figure it out, and that, she had decided, was going to have to be enough for this particular morning. Dewey came back on the 3rd day after the slide. He rode in looking like a man who had not slept in 48 hours, which was accurate, and he had 2 things with him: a written response from Magistrate Harmon Freed sealed in brown paper, and a verbal message from Thomas Reed that he delivered word for word the way Gideon had trained him to deliver messages, without editorializing. Reed's message was short. He had received the original packet. He had read everything. He was prepared to act, but needed one thing first: a living, sworn witness who could testify to the chain of custody of the documents. Without that, any competent defense attorney would argue the papers had been fabricated after the fact, and the handwriting match was circumstantial. With it, the case became something a federal court could build on. Clara read Freed's letter standing at the table while Gideon poured Dewey coffee and let the man sit down before asking anything else. Freed's handwriting was cramped and impatient, the writing of someone who considered the act of writing a necessary inconvenience rather than a pleasure. "Mrs. Ashcroft," it read, "I have reviewed the materials your man delivered. I do not have jurisdiction to act on land fraud claims in Cranes County, and you should understand that clearly before you place any weight on my involvement. What I can do is the following. I can certify the documents you have sent as having been received by this office on this date, which establishes a record outside Crane's reach. I can also communicate with federal land authority in your behalf, as that jurisdiction supersedes county entirely. I have done so. Whether they move quickly enough to be useful to your situation is not something I can promise. What I can tell you is that Aldous Crane is known to me, and anything that inconveniences him is something I am inclined to facilitate within the boundaries of my office. H. Freed, Magistrate, Northern District." She read it twice. Then she set it down and looked at Gideon. "Freed certified the documents," she said, "and he's already contacted federal land authority." "How long does federal take to move?" "He doesn't say. He says he can't promise." She tapped the letter. "But there's something here. The fact that a magistrate has certified the documents outside Crane's jurisdiction That changes the legal picture. If Crane tries to claim forgery now, he's claiming a sitting magistrate was deceived or complicit. Gideon sat down across from her. The cut above his eye had closed and was healing into a bruise that spread up toward his temple in colors that were still dramatic. He'd refused anything more than a cloth and cold water for it, which was consistent with his approach to most things physical. Reed needs a witness. Yes. Mabel Pruitt. Clara had been thinking the same thing since she read Reed's message. Mabel was the one who had kept the box. Mabel was the one who had known Samuel Whitmore, who had known what the box contained and what it meant, who had made the decision to protect it for 12 years and then put it in Clara's hands when the moment came. Mabel was the chain of custody, the living link between Samuel Whitmore's evidence and the present moment. She's 60 years old and she runs a laundry in a town that Crane controls, Clara said. She already put herself at risk when she kept that box. She didn't have a warrant on her then. No, Gideon agreed, but she knew what she was keeping. Clara got up and went to the window. The South Trail was still closed, would be closed for weeks, probably, without serious clearing work. The only practical way down the mountain now was the north route, which added 6 miles to any trip toward Harlan Creek, and the east trail that connected eventually to the Millhaven Road. They were not trapped exactly, but they were living in a place that had become harder to get in and out of, which cut both ways. She thought about Mabel, about the woman's face when she said, "Be careful," the particular quality of it, the weight that was in it. Mabel had been carrying the knowledge of what was in that box for 12 years. She had made herself into someone unremarkable, someone below notice, and she had done it deliberately because that was the only protection available to her. She was not a passive person. She was a person who had found the form of action available to her and used it. "If I go to her," Clara said, "and explain what Reed needs, she'll decide herself." "You can't go into Harlan Creek. There's a warrant." "I know." She turned from the window. "Can you get a message to her that she'd trust, without going through anyone in Crane's network?" Gideon thought about it. "There's a woman who sells eggs and produce at the South Market on Fridays. Her name is Ruth Adler. She's got a small farm 3 miles north of town. She's been selling to Mabel's Laundry for years. They're friendly. She doesn't like Crane, specifically because he tried to annex a portion of her land 4 years ago, and she fought it and won." He paused. "She comes through the Millhaven Road on her way to market. If we catch her before Friday." "Today is Wednesday," Clara said. "We'd need to send Dewey tonight." They both looked at Dewey, who had his eyes closed over his coffee cup and was approximately 40% asleep. "In the morning," Gideon said. "First light." "First light? What?" Crane moved before they were ready, which was the thing Clara had been afraid of and had been unable to prevent. On Thursday, the day before Ruth Adler's market run, the day before Dewey could reach her, a notice was posted in Harlan Creek, at the courthouse door and the post office and the front window of the general store. Clara and Gideon did not see the notice until Dewey described it to them the following afternoon, having read it himself on his way through the edge of town. The notice announced a formal hearing scheduled for the following Monday, in the matter of fraudulent land claims and criminal conspiracy charges against Gideon Ashcroft and Clara Ashcroft, née Whitmore. The presiding judge would be the Honorable Warren Pell of the County Circuit Court. All interested parties were invited to attend. Warren Pell was Crane's judge. That was not a rumor or suspicion. It was the local knowledge that everyone in the county carried, and nobody said out loud. Pell had been appointed to the circuit 8 years ago through a process that Crane had engineered, and in 8 years he had not issued a single ruling that materially inconvenienced Aldous Crane. "He's forcing the timeline," Clara said when Dewey finished describing the notice. "He knows we're trying to get to federal authority. A county court conviction preempts a lot of what federal can do. If we're convicted of forgery and fraud, any evidence we present becomes the product of convicted criminals." "You can't convict that fast," Gideon said. "Even Pell needs some form of proceeding." "He doesn't need a conviction. He needs enough of a proceeding to create a record that Crane's lawyers can use to delay federal action." She looked at the notice Dewey had written down from memory as best he could. "Monday. That's 4 days. Ruth Adler. Mabel won't be able to get to Reed in 4 days, even if she leaves tomorrow." Clara set down Dewey's handwritten summary. "Reed is in the capital. That's 3 days minimum." The room was quiet. Holt was in his usual spot by the door, watching them both with the mildly concerned attention of a dog who has learned that certain kinds of human silence precede difficult events. Clara was running it through again. The way she had been running things through for the past 2 weeks, building the map of it in her mind, looking for the places where the logic held and the places where it had gaps. Crane had the judge. Crane had the county sheriff. Crane had the warrant, the timeline, and the home terrain advantage of a man who had spent 12 years making Harlan Creek into something he controlled completely. What Crane did not have was the documents. And what Crane did not know, could not know, was what Freed had sent to Federal Land Authority, or what Reed was preparing, or the precise shape of what Clara was thinking right now. "We have to go to the hearing," she said. Gideon looked at her. "We have active warrants. Which means if we don't appear, Pell issues bench warrants, and Dole has legal authority to take us by any means necessary. If we appear, we walk into a courtroom Crane controls, in front of a judge he owns, where we're already charged with crimes." "Yes." She met his eyes. "But if we appear voluntarily, we create a public record. Everything that happens in that courtroom happens in front of witnesses. Every decision Pell makes, every piece of evidence Crane introduces, every procedural choice, it all goes into a record that a federal court can subsequently review." She paused. "Crane thinks this hearing is a trap for us. I want it to be a trap for him." Gideon was very still. "Explain." "The documents Freed has are certified and in federal hands. Reed is preparing. What we need is for Crane and Pell to commit themselves, publicly, on the record, in front of people, to a version of events that those documents directly contradict." She felt the shape of it getting clearer as she said it. "Right now Crane is careful. He's been careful for 12 years. But if he thinks the hearing is going his way, if he thinks we're trapped and losing, he'll get sloppy. He'll say things he shouldn't say. He'll let Pell rule in ways that reveal the corruption too clearly." She looked at Gideon. "I need him to feel like he's winning long enough to overextend himself." Gideon looked at her for a long moment. "That only works if there's someone in that courtroom who can use what he reveals. If federal authority isn't there to witness it, then I need to find a way to get them there." She stood up. "What time does the eastbound post rider come through the Millhaven Junction?" "Early morning, 5:30. "Dewey." She turned to Dewey, who had progressed from 40% asleep to fully awake over the course of the last 10 minutes, tracking the conversation with the focused attention of a man who understood that what was being discussed affected him. "Can you intercept the post rider at the Millhaven Junction tomorrow morning and send an urgent message directly to the Federal Land Authority office in the Capitol?" "I can do that," Dewey said. "I need to write the message tonight." She looked back at Gideon. "And I need to write a second one to Reed, telling him exactly what we're doing and asking him to move as fast as he can move." "And if Federal can't get someone to Harlan Creek by Monday?" Clara was quiet for a moment. "Then we go in anyway and we make the record as clear as we can and we hope it's enough to work from afterward." She said it plainly, without softening it. "I'd rather be in that courtroom making noise than hiding on this mountain while Pell builds a conviction against us in absentia." Gideon picked up his coffee cup, found it empty, set it back down. A man working through something in the only way available to him. She watched him do it and didn't rush it. "All right," he said. She wrote until midnight. The message to Federal Land Authority was precise and short. She had learned from writing the letter to Freed that precision was more useful than length when you needed someone to act quickly. She described the hearing, the date, the judge, the charges. She described the documents already in Freed's possession and Reed's preparation. She said, plainly, "A county court hearing controlled by the man we are accusing of fraud and murder is scheduled for Monday. We intend to appear. Any federal representation present at this hearing will witness what we believe to be a substantial public demonstration of the corruption we have documented. We are asking for someone to be there." The message to Reed was longer. She told him everything: the slide, the warrant, the hearing, what she was planning. She told him what she needed from him and when she needed it by, and she told him that if he couldn't move that fast, she understood, and they would work with whatever was possible. She signed both messages with her full name, Clara Ashcroft née Whitmore, and added Gideon's name below hers. Gideon was still up when she finished. He had spent the evening doing what he did when he was thinking, moving through the practical tasks of the ranch with methodical focus, checking the horses, reviewing the rifle rack, reorganizing the larder with the systematic attention of a man who controls small things when large ones are out of his hands. He came and read both messages when she showed them to him and made 2 small corrections of fact, and then said they were good. "You should sleep," he said. "So should you." "I will." He didn't, she thought, but she went up to the loft and lay down and managed a few hours of something that was close enough to sleep to count. Monday arrived with gray sky and a cold that had come down from the peaks overnight, the first real cold of the season, the kind that reminded you winter was not a metaphor in this part of the world. Clara put on her best dress, the one she'd been married in, which remained her best by the small margin that existed between it and her second best, and came downstairs to find Gideon already at the table in his least worn coat, his beard trimmed, his boots clean to the extent that the boots permitted it. They looked at each other across the kitchen. "Ready?" he said. "No," she said. "Let's go anyway." They took the north route down and came around to Harlan Creek from the Millhaven Road, arriving in town from a direction that most people weren't watching for. No one stopped them at the edge of town, though she saw 2 men she didn't recognize posted at what would have been the obvious approach from the mountain, waiting for people who never came that way. Crane had covered the expected entrance and left the side door open. The courthouse was a low stone building on the east side of the square, the same square where, 3 weeks ago, in a different lifetime entirely, Clara had stood on a platform in the autumn sun and listened to a crowd laugh at her. She registered the geography of it as they walked across the open ground, the building ahead of them and the square behind, and she thought about the distance between that morning and this one. The courtroom itself held perhaps 60 people. It was more than she had expected. Word had traveled, apparently, because she recognized faces from the farming and ranching community, people who had no direct stake in the proceedings but had come to watch what happened when someone challenged Aldous Crane in his own town. She registered the faces, filed them, witnesses, every one of them a potential witness. Crane was seated in the plaintiff's table with 2 lawyers she didn't recognize. He saw them come in, and his face did the thing it had done at the selection event. The quick adjustment, the careful reassembly of the civic pleasantness over whatever was underneath. He was better at it than most people, but she was watching for it now, and she saw the seam. Judge Warren Pell entered from the side door at 10 o'clock precisely. He was a lean man in his 60s with the face of someone who had long ago chosen which battles to fight and which to leave alone, and had made that choice in consistently self-interested directions. He arranged his papers, surveyed the room with the particular brand of judicial authority that derives from the costume rather than the character, and called the session to order. Clara had no lawyer. She had considered this and decided against seeking one through any Harlan Creek channel. Every attorney in the county had some relationship with Crane that she couldn't fully map. She and Gideon would represent themselves, which was legal and would appear, she hoped, to Crane and Pell as a further sign of weakness. Let them think that. The charges were read by Pell's clerk, a young man who went through the list with the careful neutrality of someone who has learned not to have opinions at work. Fraudulent claim to the Whitmore parcel, criminal conspiracy to defraud, filing of false documents, and the new edition, the one that had not been in the original warrant, assault with intent, stemming from the rock slide. That last charge was the one that worried her most, not because it was the strongest, but because it was the most visceral, the easiest for a jury to respond to emotionally. There was no jury. That was another thing she had noted. Pell had arranged it as a bench proceeding, himself as the sole arbiter, which was Crane's preferred architecture, fewer variables. The first hour went the way she expected. Crane's lawyers introduced the fraudulent deed of sale, the same one that had been used in the original probate 12 years ago, now resurrected as evidence of the Ashcrofts' alleged forgery, and 2 affidavits from the men who had been on the South Trail during the slide, attesting to the deliberate nature of the rock slide and the threat it had represented to their lives. Pell accepted both sets of documents without the usual examination of their provenance. Clara objected, formally and on the record, citing the lack of authentication process. Pell overruled her. She had expected that. The objection was not for Pell. It was for the record. She watched the room while Crane's lawyers made their opening. She watched the faces of the people who had come to observe, the farmers, the ranchers, the people who lived under Crane's administration and had their own accumulated experience of what that meant. Most of them were careful, their expressions managed. But attention is its own signal, and this room was paying close attention. Then she saw, near the back left corner, a man she didn't recognize. He was perhaps 40, well-dressed in a way that was different from Harlan Creek's version of well-dressed. Better cut, less worn, the look of someone from a city rather than a territory town. He had a leather document case on his knee, and he was watching the proceedings with the specific focused quality of someone who is not here as a spectator. She kept her face still. She looked at Gideon beside her and said nothing. But something in her chest shifted. When Pell called for the defense response, Clara stood up. She had thought carefully about what she was going to say and how she was going to say it. She was not going to make arguments she couldn't support. She was not going to raise points that Pell could shut down before they were fully made. What she was going to do was ask questions. "Your Honor," she said, "I'd like to examine the deed of sale that the plaintiff has introduced as Exhibit 1. Pell looked like he wanted to say no. He couldn't quite find the procedural ground for it. "Proceed?" She picked up the document. It was a copy. She had known it would be a copy, the original being in an oilskin pouch in Magistrate Freed's possession with a certification date that predated this hearing. She examined it with the careful attention of someone who knows exactly what she's looking for. "Your Honor, can you confirm for the record when this document was filed with the County Records Office?" Pell checked his papers. "October the 14th, 1871. And can you confirm the name of the notary who authenticated it at that time?" A pause. Pell checked again. "The record shows a notary stamp from one Robert Carver." "Robert Carver," Clara said. "Is Mr. Carver available to testify to the authenticity of his own stamp?" The pause was longer this time. Crane's lead attorney shifted in his chair with the slight movement of a man recalibrating. "Mr. Carver is deceased," Pell said. "I see. When did he die?" "I don't have that information immediately." "November of 1871, Clara said. 1 month after this document was filed. She set it down. "I raise this not to make an accusation at this moment, Your Honor, but to note it for the record. A document authenticated by a man who died 30 days later and is therefore unavailable for examination." She paused. "I also note for the record that the plaintiff has not demonstrated chain of custody for this document, has not shown how it came to be in his possession or how it was preserved over 12 years. I would request that the court require that demonstration before accepting the exhibit." Pell said, "The court is satisfied with the document's authenticity." "For the record," Clara said, "the defense objects to the acceptance of this exhibit without authentication of chain of custody, and further notes that an alternative version of this document, with significant evidentiary differences, has been certified by Magistrate Harmon Freed of the Northern District and submitted to Federal Land Authority." The courtroom changed temperature. It was subtle. Not a sound, not a movement, just a shift in the quality of the attention in the room, the way people lean forward slightly when something unexpected happens in a story they thought they had figured out. Crane's lead attorney was on his feet. "Your Honor, the defense is introducing references to materials not in evidence." "I'm not introducing them as evidence," Clara said. "I'm stating for the record that they exist and that they are in federal hands. The court can note it or not note it as it chooses." "Sustained," Pell said to Crane's attorney, though what he was sustaining was unclear. "Mrs. Ashcroft, you will confine your remarks to the matter before this court." "Of course," she said, and sat down. The morning proceeded. Crane's lawyers built their case with the efficiency of people who had built cases in this room before and knew the furniture. They introduced the affidavits from the men on the South Trail. Clara cross-examined both, carefully, on the record, asking how they had come to be on the mountain, who had employed them, what the nature of their engagement with Mayor Crane had been. Each time, Pell cut her off before the answers became useful. Each time, she noted the objection for the record. She watched Crane while she did it. He had been careful at the start, maintaining the pleasant authority of a man who expects to win. But as the morning went on, she could see the seam widening. Her questions were doing something he hadn't anticipated. Not in this room, not to Pell, but to the 60 people watching who were noting what was being cut off and why, who were building their own picture of the architecture of the proceeding. Then at midday, when Pell called a recess and the room began to move, the man in the back corner stood up and came toward the front. He reached Crane's table first and said something quietly. Clara was too far away to hear it. But she saw Crane's face. The civic pleasantness didn't slip this time. It collapsed. Just for a moment. 2 seconds. Maybe 3. And then he rebuilt it. But she saw what was underneath it, fully, for the first time. Not calculation, not controlled authority, but something rawer and colder. Fear. The man turned from Crane's table and came to where Clara was standing. "Mrs. Ashcroft," he said, "my name is Gerald Moss. I'm with the Federal Land Authority, Territorial Division." He held out a document, his credentials she assumed, and she looked at them enough to confirm they were real. "I received a communication from your office earlier this week and another from Magistrate Freed. I arrived this morning." He glanced at the room. "I've been observing." "I know," she said. "I saw you come in." He looked at her. "I need to speak with you and your husband before this afternoon's session." "Yes," she said. "You do." The recess lasted 90 minutes rather than the usual 30, a fact that Pell explained as an administrative necessity without specifying the administration being attended to. Clara spent 40 of those minutes with Gerald Moss in a small room off the courthouse corridor, with Gideon beside her and Moss's document case open on the table between them. Moss was efficient. He didn't waste the time they had on pleasantries or preamble. He had Freed's certified copies. He had reviewed them. He had conferred this morning, before the session began, with a colleague in the Capitol who had spoken with Thomas Reed. He laid out plainly what federal jurisdiction could and could not do, what the certified documents established, what the hearing record they were building could be used for. "The hearing record is the key piece," Moss said. "What you're doing in there, the objections, the questions, the references to certified materials, that creates an administrative basis for federal review of the county proceeding. If Pell rules against you today, that ruling goes into federal review. And with the documents Freed certified, that review has substance." "How long does review take?" Gideon said. "In normal circumstances, months. In circumstances where there's evidence of active corruption in a judicial proceeding, which is what your objections are establishing, it can move faster." He looked at Clara. "But I want to be honest with you. I cannot guarantee any timeline." "I understand," Clara said. "What I need you to do is be visible. When the afternoon session starts, I need Crane and Pell to know you're there in an official capacity, not in the back corner. At the front." Moss looked at her. "You want him to make mistakes." "I want him to feel like the room has changed," she said, "because it has." Moss considered this. Then he nodded, closed his document case, and stood up. "I'll be at the front." The afternoon session opened differently from the morning. Moss was seated in the front row, his credentials on the bench in front of him where Pell could see them, his federal identification visible to anyone who looked. Clara watched Crane register it, watched him lean toward his lead attorney and exchange a few quiet words, and watched the lead attorney's expression go through something careful and controlled. Pell called the room to order, and his voice had a quality it hadn't had in the morning, a tightness. Clara stood up. "Your Honor, I'd like to enter into the record a series of financial documents pertaining to the land company through which the plaintiff filed the original probate claim against the Whitmore estate in 1871. Crane's attorney was on his feet immediately. "Objection. These materials were not submitted." "I'm submitting them now," Clara said. She had copies, not the originals, which were safely in federal hands, but certified copies that Moss had brought with him from the Capitol, stamped with Freed's certification. She walked them to Pell's clerk and set them on the desk. "These are certified copies of letters establishing financial transactions between the land company and an account in the plaintiff's name dated in the months preceding my father's death. They are certified by Magistrate Harmon Freed of the Northern District, whose certification appears on each page. The room had gone very quiet. Pell looked at the documents. He looked at Moss in the front row. He looked at Crane. Clara watched all 3 of these looks happen in sequence. She watched the calculation running behind Pell's face, the old calculation, the one he'd been running for 8 years in this room, which was about what was safe and what was profitable and which way the wind was blowing. She watched it run into something it hadn't encountered before. "Your Honor," Crane's attorney said, and his voice had changed too. Harder now, more aggressive, which meant the careful version wasn't working anymore. "These documents are fabrications produced by a defendant with a clear motive to deceive this court." "The certification disagrees," Clara said. Freed has no jurisdiction. Freed has jurisdiction to certify documents received by his office. He has done so. The date of his certification precedes this hearing by 8 days, which establishes that these materials existed before these charges were filed. She turned, and she was not looking at Pell now. She was looking at the 60 people in the room, the farmers, the ranchers, the townspeople who had lived under this administration for years. The plaintiff is accusing my husband and me of fabricating documents to defraud this court. What you are looking at is a federal certification establishing that these documents were in official hands before this proceeding began. I would ask every person in this room to note that. Pell said, "Mrs. Ashcroft, you will address the bench, not the gallery." "I apologize, Your Honor." She turned back. I would ask the court to note it. What happened next was the thing she had been working toward without being entirely certain it would come. Crane stood up. He stood up without being addressed, without his attorney's introduction, without the procedural form that governed who spoke when in a courtroom. He stood up because he had been sitting in that chair watching the morning's proceedings and then the afternoons, watching the room shift, watching Moss in the front row, watching the certified documents go to the clerk, and the calculation had finally outrun the control. "These people are criminals," he said. His voice carried. It was a voice trained to carry. "They are fraudsters, and they are dangerous, and this court has the evidence before it to deal with them accordingly. The land claim is clear. The violence on the South Trail is documented. Whatever they have put together with a friendly magistrate in another district does not change what this court knows." The courtroom was absolutely silent. Pell said carefully, "Mayor Crane, Warren." Crane's voice dropped, and in dropping it and using the given name, he made a mistake so clean and clear that Clara almost felt sorry for him. Almost. "We have handled things correctly for years, and I expect this court to continue to do so." Gerald Moss was writing. His pen moved steadily across the page in front of him, and he did not look up, and the sound of it in the silent room was the most significant sound Clara had heard in a very long time. She let the silence run for 3 full seconds. Then she said, quietly, to no one in particular, and therefore to everyone, "For the record, it was enough. It was exactly enough." The mayor of Harlan Creek had stood up in his own controlled courtroom in front of 60 witnesses and a federal official and told his judge, by name, what he expected. The record now held that. Whatever Pell ruled today, whatever Crane's lawyers filed, whatever procedural machinery they brought to bear in the days and weeks ahead, the record held what had happened in this room on this afternoon. Pell did not rule that day. He cited administrative need for review and adjourned the session, which was not the outcome Crane had planned, and the fact that it was not the planned outcome was visible on Crane's face as the room emptied. Clara packed her papers methodically, taking her time, not looking at the plaintiff's table. Gideon stood beside her and said nothing, which was the right thing. Moss found them at the door. "I'll be filing my observation report tonight," he said. "What happened this afternoon? The mayor's statement is exactly the kind of documentation that accelerates federal review." "How fast?" Gideon said. "Fast," Moss said. "I won't give you a number because I've learned not to, but fast." They walked out of the courthouse into the cold afternoon. The square was mostly empty. The crowd had dispersed, returning to the business of their days. A few people lingered, watching the Ashcrofts cross the square with the quality of attention that had changed since the morning of the selection event. It was still attention, but the quality of it was different now. Clara crossed the square and did not look back at the courthouse. She was thinking about her father, about what he had gathered and what it had cost him, about 12 years of waiting that had ended in a cedar sewing box and a woman on a platform and a man who had taken off his hat, about the record that now existed in a federal official's notebook and what it meant for the days ahead. She didn't know yet how it would end. She knew how she wanted it to end, which was not the same thing. But she knew that Crane had stood up in his own room and reached for his judge's given name in front of the wrong witness, and that nothing that came after today would be able to erase that. It was not a victory. It was the thing that makes victory possible. She walked with her husband through the cold afternoon air toward the horses, toward the long road back up the mountain, and she did not feel triumphant exactly. She felt like a person who has been moving toward something for a long time and has finally gotten close enough to see its shape. The ride back up the mountain that evening was the quietest they had shared since the first night. Not uncomfortable quiet, It was a different quality from the careful distance of two strangers learning each other's edges. This was the quiet of people who have been through something together and are still processing the shape of it, still turning it over, not yet ready to put words to something that words might diminish. The cold had settled fully by the time they reached the north route, their breath visible in the lamplight, the horses moving steadily through the dark with the patient confidence of animals who know the way home. Clara sat on the wagon bench and watched the tree line pass and thought about Crane's face when he'd said, "Warren." The naked quality of it. The moment when 12 years of careful architecture had cracked under pressure and shown what was underneath. She had been working toward that moment without knowing exactly what form it would take, and now that it had happened, she felt not the triumph she might have expected, but something quieter and more complicated. Relief, partly, and something that was almost grief. In a strange way she couldn't entirely account for. Grief for the years her father hadn't gotten, for her mother's careful hands on a cedar box, for all the time that had passed in the service of something that should never have needed to happen in the first place. "You're thinking about him," Gideon said. Not a question. "Both of them," she said. "My father? My mother?" He nodded. The wagon took a slow bend, and the mountain opened briefly before closing around them again. "She knew, didn't she?" Clara said. "My mother. She knew what killed him, and she kept that box her whole life, and she just kept it." "She was one person," Gideon said, "with a child, and no one to trust." "I know." She did know. She had known it intellectually since the beginning, but knowing a thing intellectually and knowing it in your chest are two different knowings, and tonight it was the chest version. "I just keep thinking about how long she carried it, how heavy it must have been." Gideon was quiet for a moment. "Your father trusted that it would reach the right hands eventually. That's why he hid it instead of destroying it. He trusted her to hold it until the time came. She held it for 12 years. "She did," he said, "and then she put it in the right hands." Clara turned that over. She thought about the chain of it, Samuel Whitmore gathering his evidence and hiding it before someone could stop him, her mother holding the secret through illness and poverty and grief, Mabel Pruitt keeping a cedar box under a laundry counter for however many years and saying nothing to anyone. And then a morning on a platform in autumn sun, when something in Clara had crossed a threshold she hadn't known was there. All of it connected, all of it necessary. Remove any single piece, and the chain doesn't hold. She was not a person who believed things happened for reasons, in the tidy way that phrase usually meant. What she believed was that people made choices under pressure, and that sometimes those choices accumulated into something that looked, from a distance, like fate. It wasn't fate. It was just human beings doing the best they could with what they had, over and over, until one day it was enough. The Federal Review moved the way Moss had promised, faster than normal, slower than anyone wanted. In the 2 weeks following the hearing, Harlan Creek existed in a particular suspension, the way a place exists when everyone knows something is coming, but no one knows its exact shape yet. Pell had not issued a ruling. Crane had not made another public move. The 3 men from the hotel had apparently left town sometime the week after the hearing, which Dewey confirmed on his next supply run. Sheriff Dole had not been seen at the courthouse. The warrant remained technically active, which meant Clara and Gideon stayed off the main roads, but no one came to enforce it. Thomas Reed arrived at the Millhaven Junction on a Thursday, 2 weeks and 3 days after the hearing, and sent word up through Dewey. He wanted to meet. He had news. They came down the north route and met him at a roadhouse 6 miles from Harlan Creek, a practical, unfussy place that served coffee and kept its own business. Reed was a compact man in his 40s with a lawyer's careful eyes and the slightly worn quality of someone who had been traveling hard for several days. He shook hands with both of them, sat down, and got directly to the point. The Federal Land Authority had completed its expedited review. Moss's report had been the decisive document, the official record of what had occurred in the courtroom, specifically Crane's direct address to Pell by given name and the explicit statement of expectation observed and transcribed by a federal officer in his official capacity. Combined with the certified documents from Freed's office, the original deeds, the letters, the handwriting matched to the fraudulent deed of sale, It constituted what Reed described as an unusually complete record of both the original fraud and the subsequent attempt to use a compromised judicial proceeding to suppress evidence of it. The Federal Land Authority has voided the 1871 probate ruling, Reed said. The basis is procedural fraud. The ruling was obtained through the submission of a fabricated document and the corruption of the presiding officer. That's the Whitmore parcel. 420 acres, the deed reverts to the Whitmore estate, which is presently yourself, Mrs. Ashcroft, as the surviving heir. Clara heard the words. She heard them clearly. She had been working toward them for weeks, and they still arrived with more weight than she'd been braced for. And Crane? Gideon said. Federal indictment, Reed said. Filed this morning, which is why I'm here today rather than tomorrow. The charges include fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, corruption of a judicial officer, and, this part took longer to establish, but Moss was thorough, conspiracy in the death of Samuel Whitmore. The evidence on that last charge is circumstantial, but substantial, and the federal prosecutor believes it's prosecutable. He paused. Dole has been suspended pending investigation of his involvement in the warrant and the arrangement of armed men on the South Trail. Pell has been removed from the bench as of yesterday. Gideon said nothing. Clara said nothing. The roadhouse around them was its ordinary self, coffee smell, wood smoke, two men at the far end of the room, engaged in conversation that had nothing to do with any of this. The warrants against you and your husband, Reed continued, have been vacated. They were issued by an officer, Dole, whose authority is currently suspended and whose conduct in issuing them is part of the active investigation. Legally, they don't exist anymore. Clara set down her coffee cup. Her hands were steady, which surprised her slightly. She had expected some physical response, shaking or tears or something, and instead she felt very still, the way she had felt standing on the platform 3 weeks ago with 200 people watching. The same quality of quiet at the center of something loud. My father's name, she said. The indictment. It will establish publicly what happened to him. The indictment charges conspiracy in his death. Yes. Reed looked at her directly. It won't give you everything you might want from it. Crane's lawyers will fight every step. It will take time, but it will be a public record. Samuel Whitmore's name will be in that record as a man who was murdered for his land, and Aldous Crane's name will be in it as the man responsible. She thought about her father, about a man she had known for 14 years before she lost him, most of those years too young to understand who he was outside of being her father. She thought about him riding a flat creek road in good weather on a horse he'd known for years, and what had happened on that road, and who had arranged for it to happen. She thought about 12 years of his name attached to nothing except an accident and a loss, and a daughter left behind to work in a laundry. Yes, she said. Thank you. Aldous Crane was arrested on a Friday morning in his office at the town hall by 2 federal marshals who had ridden in from the capital the previous night. Dewey was in town for supplies and saw it happen and rode back up to the ranch faster than was his habit, and his account of it was factual and brief in the way that accounts of significant things sometimes are when the person delivering them understands that the significance speaks for itself. He didn't say anything, Dewey said. When they put the irons on him, I mean. He just looked at the building, like he was saying goodbye to it. Clara thought about that for a while after Dewey went out to the barn. She thought about what it means to build something that is entirely dependent on your own power to maintain it. Every piece of it constructed around your continued control so that the moment the control goes, the whole structure goes with it. Crane had spent 30 years building Harlan Creek into a place that worked for him, and he had done it in such a way that nothing in it would survive his removal. She didn't feel sorry for him, but she recognized the particular kind of waste in it, a man of obvious capability and energy who had directed all of it toward holding, never toward building anything that could stand on its own. Her father had built a ranch on 420 acres, and it had still been there, the land itself, 12 years after everything else was taken. The land had just been waiting. Well, she went to see Mabel Pruitt the following week. It was the first time she had been in Harlan Creek in any ordinary way. Not arriving with a warrant on her head, not moving through back routes, just riding in on the main road on a clear November morning with the frost still on the ground and the town going about its business. The feeling of it was strange, not triumphant exactly, just different from what she'd expected. The town was the same town. The hardware store was in the same place. The square was the same square. The platform from the selection event had been taken down, which she noted without particular feeling. Mabel was at the laundry, where she always was. She looked up when Clara came through the door, and her expression did not do the thing most people's expressions did when they saw Clara now. The new version of attention, the reassessment that had been visible in people's faces since the indictment, and the voided ruling had circulated through the county. Mabel just looked at her the way she had always looked at her, with the direct, unsentimental attention of someone who had never needed to reassess because they had never underestimated. "You look tired," Mabel said. "I am tired," Clara said. "Sit down then." She sat down on the same stool she had sat on for 4 years, behind the same counter, and Mabel put water on for tea, and for a few minutes they were just two women in a laundry in a November morning. "They told me what you did," Clara said. "Reed did. He looked into the chain of custody. He said you told him you'd been keeping the box since my mother died, that she gave it to you directly." "She did," Mabel said. She poured the water without looking up. "She brought it to me 3 weeks before she passed. She said she didn't know what to do with it, and she didn't have the strength to figure it out anymore, and she needed someone to hold it until Clara was old enough and had someone she could trust." Clara was quiet. "She talked about your father," Mabel said. "In those last weeks. She talked about him more than she had in years. She said he always believed in doing the right thing, even when it was the harder thing, and she was sorry she hadn't been able to do more with what he left." Mabel set the tea down and looked at Clara directly. "She didn't fail, you understand. She was one person with no resources and a child to raise, and she kept that box safe for 8 years while she was alive. That's not failure." "I know," Clara said. And she did know. She had made her peace with it, more or less in the way that you make peace with things that are genuinely unfair. Not by deciding they were fair after all, but by deciding that the unfairness doesn't get to be the end of the story. "Is it settled?" Mabel said. "Truly settled? The land is ours. The indictment is filed. Crane is in federal custody." Clara wrapped her hands around the teacup. "Pell is gone. Dole is under investigation. Reedy says there will be more charges as the federal investigation develops. Other land seizures, other people Crane moved against over the years. It's going to take time." She paused. "But yes, truly settled." Mabel nodded once. She picked up a shirt from the pile beside her and began examining the collar, which was her way of concluding the emotional portion of a conversation and returning to ordinary life, which Clara had always respected. "How is he?" Mabel said. "The mountain man." Clara smiled, which was not a thing she did often, and which changed her face when she did it. "He's learning how to have someone else in his house," she said. "He's not fast at it, but he's trying." Mabel made a sound that was not quite approval and not quite amusement, but occupied the territory between them. "That'll do," she said. The South Trail was cleared by mid-November, the debris from the rock slide worked through by a hired crew over the better part of 2 weeks. The upper range was accessible again, which mattered for the winter grazing rotation, and Gideon went back to the work of the ranch with a focused energy that Clara recognized as relief. The relief of a man who had been living in a state of siege for a very long time and has finally been allowed to just be a rancher again. She went with him most days. She had been going with him for weeks now, and the habit of it had settled into something that felt natural in the way that only things you've done repeatedly enough start to feel natural. She wasn't a rancher by training. She made mistakes, read terrain wrong sometimes, made a call about the cattle that cost them half a day of work, once left a gate in a condition that required fixing the following morning. She acknowledged the mistakes without drama and fixed what could be fixed and learned what each one taught her, and Gideon said nothing about them beyond what was necessary for the fix, which was the only way she would have accepted it. One evening in late November, with the first real snow of the season coming down outside and the stove going, and Holt arranged in his spot by the door, Gideon said without apparent preamble, "I want to show you the south boundary tomorrow, the full survey line." She looked up from the surveying manual, which she had nearly finished. "Why tomorrow specifically?" "Because," he said, and stopped. She waited. "Because it's your land now too, south of the Callaway River. It borders the north edge of the Whitmore parcel." He was looking at the table, not at her, the way he looked at things when he was working through how to say something. When the transfer completes, we'll share a boundary line. She looked at him for a moment. You've been thinking about that. Some. About what it means. Some, he said again. A pause. I was thinking we could run them together. The two ranches. It would take work. There are fencing decisions, water rights that need to be sorted out. The access road from the Whitmore side needs significant repair. He looked up finally. It's a practical consideration. Is that what it is? She said. He held her gaze. There was something in his face that she had been watching develop over weeks without naming it, the way you watch weather come in and know what it is before it arrives. It's also not only that, he said. Clara set down the manual. Outside, the snow was coming down steadily, the kind that settled rather than drove, a quiet covering that changed the shape of everything it touched. She thought about the morning she had walked across the square, the decision that had not felt like a decision so much as a threshold crossed. She thought about all the things that had happened since and how none of them had broken her, which she hadn't been certain of at the time but had hoped. Show me the boundary line tomorrow, she said. He nodded. Something in his shoulders settled slightly. She noticed that and said nothing about it, which was its own kind of tenderness. The Whitmore parcel transfer was completed in the first week of December, processed through the Federal Land Authority with a speed that reflected the particular desire of institutions to visibly correct their own errors when those errors had become public record. Clara signed the documents in Reed's office in the Capitol, with Gideon beside her, and the signature was the same signature she had always had, a slightly cramped C, the rest of it flowing. But it meant something different when she lifted the pen afterward. 420 acres, her father's land grant, his 12 years of work, the thing that had been taken and buried under fraudulent paperwork and a dead man's silence. Back in Whitmore hands, or as close to it as the law permitted, Ashcroft Whitmore technically, which was how the deed read, which she had insisted on. She stood outside Reed's office in the December cold and looked at the street and thought about her father riding this territory 30 years ago. Young and probably optimistic in the way that young people are when they're building something, when the future still looks like a place you can design rather than a thing that happens to you. He had not gotten to see what his work became. He had not gotten to see his daughter's name on the deed that descended from his. She could not fix that. Nobody could fix that. The loss was the loss, and it remained the loss, and no legal document changed the fundamental fact of it. But she had his name back. She had the truth of what happened to him in a federal record that would not disappear. She had 420 acres of good grass and good water and a timber stand in the northeast corner. And she had, improbably and against every reasonable expectation, a husband who was learning to share his house and his mountain and his life with someone who had asked for it out of nothing more than a particular quality of determination. It wasn't the life her father had planned for her or that she had planned for herself. It was the life that had assembled itself from the materials available, which is usually how lives actually work. She could live with that. She thought she could do more than live with it. But the following spring, they started building. It was Clara's idea initially, and then Gideon's in the way that ideas sometimes transfer. Not because he was persuaded so much, as because he heard it and recognized something he had been thinking without knowing he was thinking it. The Whitmore parcel had the old ranch house, structurally damaged but salvageable, and 3 outbuildings in varying states of repair. She proposed using them, not just for themselves, not just for the combined operation of 2 ranches managed as one, but for something larger. There were women in the territory, she had noticed, women who were in the position she had been in, or worse, widows with children and no land and no income and no good options. Women who had been pushed off their claims or lost their husbands to accidents or illness or violence and were working laundries and kitchens and other people's houses for wages that kept them exactly at the edge of surviving. She knew what that felt like. She knew it from the inside, which is different from knowing it as an observer. The ranch had space. The Whitmore house, repaired properly, could hold families. The land could produce with the right labor arrangement. She had spent enough time with the surveying manual and enough months learning the terrain to know what the 2 parcels together could support. She put it to Gideon on an April evening when the snow was finally gone from the lower trails and the kitchen garden was starting to show the first green suggestions of the season. She laid it out plainly, what she was thinking, what it would cost, what it would require, the ways it would be difficult, the ways she thought it could work. She did not soften any part of it or make it smaller to seem more palatable. He listened the way he always listened, fully, without interrupting, without the impatience that most people eventually showed when someone was laying out a complicated idea. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "The North Outbuilding needs a new roof," he said. "I know. And the access road from the Whitmore side is going to need real work before it can take wagon traffic consistently." "I know that too." He nodded. "We'll start with the road then." She looked at him. He was looking at his coffee cup, and there was something on his face that she had learned over months to read, as the expression that meant he felt something he wasn't going to name directly, but wasn't going to hide either. "Gideon," she said. He looked up. "Thank you." He looked at her for a moment. "You don't need to thank me for things that are right," he said. "I know I don't need to," she said. "I'm doing it anyway." The first family arrived in June. A woman named Iris Doyle, 34 years old, with two boys aged 8 and 10, and a claim that had been stripped from her the previous year through a process that bore, in its outlines, a recognizable resemblance to what had happened to the Whitmore parcel 12 years ago, though on a smaller scale, and without murder, as far as anyone could establish. She came up the repaired access road in a wagon, with most of what she owned packed in the back, and the careful, appraising expression of someone who has learned not to trust, offered help until it proves itself. Clara met her at the gate. She showed her the repaired house, the kitchen garden, the water rights arrangement, the work-share structure she had designed with the same methodical attention she had applied to everything since the day she climbed into Gideon's wagon. She told Iris plainly what was expected and what was provided, and she answered the questions Iris asked, which were practical, pointed questions. The questions of a woman who had been deceived before and was not planning to be deceived again, as directly as she had been asked them. At the end of it, Iris looked at her and said, "You were the woman on the platform, the one who walked across the square." Clara looked at her. "Yes. I heard about that." Iris was quiet for a moment. "I thought it was the bravest thing I'd ever heard." Clara considered this. She had heard various versions of the story over the months since the hearing and the indictment. The story had moved through the territory the way stories do, changed by each retelling, acquiring details that weren't there and losing some that were. The version that had traveled mostly concerned the bravery of it, the audacity, the way the feared mountain man had removed his hat. It was a good story. She understood why it had traveled, but what she remembered from that morning was not bravery exactly. She remembered the exhaustion underneath the action, the specific tiredness of a person who has been enduring something for a long time and has simply, finally, run out of the capacity to keep enduring it quietly. She hadn't walked across the square because she was brave. She had walked across the square because she was done standing still, and walking was the only other option available. She didn't say this to Iris. What she said was, "Come inside, let me show you the kitchen." By autumn, there were 3 families on the Whitmore parcel. The North Outbuilding had its new roof. The access road could take 2 wagons abreast. The kitchen garden, expanded over the summer with additional hands to work it, had produced enough to put up winter stores with surplus. It was not a smooth operation. There were conflicts and miscommunications, and one serious dispute over a boundary between 2 of the family's working areas that took 2 weeks and several difficult conversations to resolve. Clara mediated all of it without pretending it was simple, which it wasn't, and without expecting it to be perfect, which it never would be. Gideon worked alongside all of it with the same quality of focused, uncommented participation he brought to everything. He was not a man who had ever intended to be surrounded by people, and the adjustment was real and visible and imperfect. He got things wrong sometimes, but misjudged a tone, retreated into his own silence at moments when someone needed him to stay. Clara told him when he got it wrong, straightforwardly, without punishing him for it. And he listened the way he listened to everything and made adjustments that were genuine, if not always fast. He was, she had decided, one of the most honest people she had ever known. Honest in the specific sense of not performing anything he didn't feel, which meant that when he was present, he was fully present, and that was worth more than polish. She had not expected to love him. That wasn't part of the calculation she had made on the platform in the autumn sun, looking across the square at a man she didn't know. But love, she had found, is not particularly interested in what you expected. It arrives by accumulation, by mornings of coffee before full light, and evenings of working through problems together, and long silences that are comfortable rather than empty, and the specific knowledge of how another person moves through difficulty, which is a more intimate knowledge than most people recognize. She loved the way he checked on Holt before bed without thinking about it. She loved the margin notes in his surveying manual, precise and sometimes acerbic. She loved the way he had said, "I was thinking we could run them together," while looking at the table, which was as close to declaring himself as he was probably capable of, and which she had understood completely. He had told her once, in the winter after everything settled, that the day on the platform had not looked to him like bravery from the outside either. She had asked him what it looked like. "Like someone who decided," he said. "You just decided, and then did it." She had thought about that for a long time. She thought about it still, sometimes, when she was up on the North Ridge in the early morning, with the valley spread below her, and the light coming over the peaks, in the way it did at that hour, gradual and without drama. She thought about her father deciding to gather his evidence and trust his wife to keep it. She thought about her mother deciding to hold that trust for 8 years and then put it in the right hands. She thought about Mabel Pruitt deciding, quietly and without recognition, to be the person who kept a secret that needed keeping. She thought about the chain of ordinary decisions, each one made by a person under pressure with imperfect information and no guarantee of outcome, that had led to this morning on this ridge. Nobody got to choose the circumstances they were handed. You got what you got. The poverty or the injustice or the loss, the thing that stood between you and the life you might otherwise have had. What you got to choose was what you did with what you had, which was not a small choice, which was, in the end, the only choice that mattered. The woman who had stood on a platform while a crowd laughed at her was still in her. She had not gone away. She was there in the calluses on her hands, and the particular way Clara moved through hard terrain, and the directness that sometimes made people uncomfortable. But she was not all of Clara, and she was not the last word on what Clara was. People who have been diminished learn either to believe the diminishment or to refuse it, and the refusal is not a single dramatic moment. It is 1,000 small ones. It is every morning you get up and do the work anyway. It is every time you hold your ground, not because you're certain you'll win, but because holding your ground is the right thing, and you have decided that matters more than the outcome. Clara came down from the ridge as the sun cleared the peaks, and the ranch below her came fully into light. She could see Gideon at the barn, his breath visible in the morning air, moving through the early work with the economical steadiness that was his particular signature. She could see the repaired Whitmore house with its window catching the first sun, the kitchen garden in its late-season state, the access road running smooth and clear to the south boundary. She could see Iris Doyle's boys already out by the fence, doing the thing children do when they live somewhere that feels like home. Just being in it, without particular purpose, because the place itself is enough. None of it was perfect. It had all been hard in ways she had not fully anticipated, and it would be hard in ways she couldn't yet anticipate, because that was the nature of things that were real. But it was hers, and it was built from honest materials, and it would still be standing when she was gone. She walked down to the barn, and Gideon looked up when she came through the door and said, "Coffee's on." And she said, "Good," and went inside to pour it. And the morning went on the way mornings do when the hard part is finally behind you, and the rest of it, whatever it holds, is still ahead.